Thank you everyone for joining on this lovely afternoon in New York, and later in the day for joining from Israel, early in the day for joining from further west. This is a class. This is the first session of Mishnah in Depth, Masechet Nazir Sotah with Rabbi Avie Walfish. This class is a continuation of the previous Mishnah in Depth classes, such as Mishnah in Depth Ketubot and Nidarim with Rabbi Leah Sarna and Rabbi David Silver, respectively. This is the first of several sessions. We will be continuing for the next few weeks, including on Chol HaMoed Pesach. And it's really a pleasure to be learning with Rabbi Walfish. We've just had the pleasure of hosting him for a teacher of Mishnah before. For those not familiar, he is a currently retired teacher of Talmudic literature and rabbinic thought. He is the head of the Halachic Beit Midrash at the Beit Hillel Rabbinical Organization, with degrees from Yeshiva University in philosophy, as well as a Talmud student of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and Rav Soloveitchik. After making Aliyah, he received smicha from Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg and received a PhD and MD from Hebrew University, writing on literary features of Mishnah. He has lectured in many frameworks in Israel and abroad, as well as published extensively on areas of Jewish studies, including the Iyun Mishnah website and a commentary on Mishnah Brachot, Mishnaic tapestries. And in 2005, he was awarded the prize of the Israeli Ministry of Education for creative work in Jewish culture. He also taught the poetics of Mishnah at Rifka a couple semesters ago. And with everyone joining in, I just want to send invitations to panelists so that you can ask questions of Rabbi Walfish directly. Speak up, turn on your camera if you so wish. And even if no matter what platform you're on, whether on Zoom or on Facebook, please do ask questions. If you ask questions in chat, I'm happy to relay them to the teacher. And if you use the raise your hand function or shoot me a message, I can also make you a panelist so you can ask yourself. And with that, I want to hand things over. Thank you everyone for joining. Please continue to come in. Please keep learning with Rifka.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. It's always a pleasure to teach for Rifka, and especially to teach Mishnah, which as you've heard, is a text of which I'm particularly fond, and which I think needs to be looked at in new and creative ways that haven't been explored in the past. Okay, this program, as I'm sure you know, is plugging into the Mishnah Yomit framework, which learns two Mishnayot a day. So my premise is going to be that people have prepared the Mishnayot in advance, at least on a fundamental basic level. If you haven't, I expect you should still be able to follow. Okay, and the texts that we'll be using here that I put up on the screen, at least the Mishnah text will have English translation. When I make reference to other supporting texts, they generally won't have English translation, but for the Mishnah, we'll use the Svaria site, and you'll have the English translation in front of you. Okay, I'll start by saying something that I like to note when I study and teach Mishnah is that I differentiate between studying Mishnah and studying Mishnayot. And in fact, very few people study what I call Mishnah. Mostly people study what I would call Mishnayot, which means you learn a Mishnah, figure out what it's saying on one level or another, greater depth, lesser depth, whatever, you have a sense of it, you move on to the next Mishnah. You learn that one, you move on to the next Mishnah. Okay, and what you're missing there is you are learning Mishnayot, short Mishnah units. Okay, what you're not learning is Mishnah. Okay, so you see, Mishnah is not like, let's say, studying Tanakh. when you study Tanakh, there's a flow, okay? It's either a narrative flow or it might be a series of halachot that aren't always arranged logically. And in fact, in those places, sometimes people would be doing much the same thing, be learning short passages. Or there could be a poetic flow if you're talking about prophecies or other poetic works. So there's a basic overall structure. You're not learning one pasuk and then another pasuk and then another pasuk. You're seeing how the psukim hang together. That's what generally people are doing in studying Tanakh. In studying Mishnah, generally people are studying individual units, not looking at the overall units. Okay, there is an advantage to that because trying to study the overall units in Mishnah is often extremely challenging because Mishnah is not always arranged in ways where you can readily see the structure. Okay, and but that's what I enjoy doing, and B, I think it's crucially important, especially if you want to retain any of what you've learned. Okay, if you learn Mishnah Yomit, you learn one Mishnah, another Mishnah, another Mishnah. By the time you've learned the fifth Mishnah, if someone asks, well, 2 days ago, you learned another Mishnah. Do you remember what it said there? I think a lot of people would find it challenging. But if at the end of a chapter, you go back and say, what is this chapter about? Well, the answers, as I've mentioned, are not always readily apparent. But just raising the question requires you to look back over the different Mishnayot that you've learned, and then to try to figure out what do they have in common, where are they different, where are they going, and that already helps you to retain what you've learned. And if you succeed in cracking the code of the Mishnah and understanding what is it that binds these Mishnayot together, then that gives you a structure and an overall framework that helps you retain at least some of the material that you've learned. Okay, one of the things I learned in my Mishnah research is how memory works. And one of the things about memory is that memory retains structures much better than it retains individual points. And when you have the structure, then it helps you to remember the individual points because you remember where they fit into that overall structure. Okay, so this is not a guarantee you're going to remember everything by heart, but it does help take what you've learned and give it not only a logical structure, but also a structure that helps you retain more of what it is that you've studied. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. Of course, it can't come at the expense of understanding the individual Mishnayot. To understand the structure, you have to have a basic understanding of the individual Mishnayot, and sometimes to get to the structure, you have to go a little deeper in understanding the Mishnayot. So we're going to be weaving back and forth between those two. For those of you who are familiar with hermeneutical thought, the theory of interpretation. So hermeneutics is always doing that. It's always trying to fit the details into the overall structure, but you can only get the overall structure by comprehending the details. So you're always moving back and forth between them, and we'll be doing a lot of that in my classes. Okay, so all of that by way of introduction. So let's dive in. Okay, the unit we're supposed to be covering, which is the unit that the Mishnah Yomit has been learning over the past week, okay, is most of the last chapter of Nidarim and a good part of the first chapter of Nazir. So we're at a transition point. So we'll be devoting part of the shiur tonight to Nidarim, and not just the last chapter, but I'm going to use that to get a kind of overall picture of what goes on in Nidarim. I know those of you who studied with Rabbi Silber, I know he tried to do some of that in his lecture. I don't know exactly what he did. I have a general ballpark idea, the kinds of things he was aiming for there, and I'm going to be looking at the overall structure of Nidarim from a somewhat different perspective. Okay, so even if there's repetition, which by the way is good, Mishnah comes from a word that means repetition. Okay, that's what Mishnah is supposed to be. You're supposed to repeat it. Okay, so I'm not averse to repetition, but I think repetition in teaching is generally most effective when it's repetition with variation. So I imagine even when there's overlap and repetition, there will be some new perspectives on it. Okay, so let's start off with Nidarim, and let me start off with an overall question about Nidarim. Okay, and the overall question has to do with where Nidarim fits into the overall scheme of Mishnah. Okay, when Kayla presented the previous Masechtot that were studied here in this Drisha program, she mentioned Ktubot, and then Nidarim, and then following that is Nazir. Okay, now Ktubot belongs to one of the 6 orders of the Mishnah. The Mishnah has 6 orders, 6 Sidarim. Which order does Ktubot belong to?
Nashim.
Nashim. Okay, that makes sense, right? That doesn't need too much explanation. But then we move from Ktubot to Nidarim, and we start to wonder, what in heaven's name is Nidarim doing in Seder Nashim? Okay, is Nidarim about Nashim? Okay, I understand the other Masechtot in Seder Nashim are Yevamot, okay, Yevamot, levirate marriages, okay, I understand how that fits into Nashim. Ktubot, Ktubah, integral part of a marriage. Okay, skip over Nidarim and Nazir for a moment. And then after Nazir comes Sotah. Okay, Sotah is when something wrong happens in the marriage. Then after that we have Gitin, okay, the dissolution of the marriage, and Kiddushin, okay, creating the marriage. Okay, one might wonder why Kiddushin comes at the very end, and why Gitin comes before Kiddushin, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, all of those Masechtot, I understand, belong in Seder Nashim. But the 2 tractates that we're talking about, Nidarim and Nazir, what in heaven's name do they have to do with Nashim?
Much of Nidarim had to do with the Hatarat and Hafarat Nidarim, which had to do with Nashim.
Okay, good. Now you say much of Nidarim has to do with that. I mean, let me start by saying your answer, is basically correct. But when you say much of Nidarim has to do with Hafarat Nidarim, because that Hatarat Nidarim has nothing to do with Nashim, right? But Hafarat Nidarim, right? Hatarat Nidarim means dissolving vows by means of going to a Beit Din, okay, or a Torah sage who will then find a petach, okay, or possibly charata. Okay, he'll find something about you regret having taken the neder, or you didn't fully understand what you were doing and taking the neder. Sometimes it's somewhat fabricated. He will fabricate a misunderstanding. That's often what happens in Hatarat Nidarim. All of that has nothing to do with Nashim. Okay, a man's neder, a woman's neder, okay, are all the same here, and you take it to a Beit Din or a Talmid Chacham, and they do it for you. Hafarat Nidarim is very much a Nashim matter, because Hafarat Nidarim is either done from father to daughter, or from husband to wife, or in the case of a na'ara, okay, in other words, someone who is old enough to take nidarim, okay, but still young enough to be considered to be part of her father's household, and ma'orasa, she's betrothed, which means she has entered the first stage of marriage, but not yet started living with her husband. So she's in a kind of twilight zone where she is somewhat within her husband's household and somewhat within her father's household, and therefore the hafara has to be done jointly by father and husband. Okay, that certainly has a lot to do with nashim. Okay, okay, so hafarat nidarim is very much a nashim matter. How much of tractate nidarim is devoted to hafarat nidarim?
2 prakim.
2 prakim out of how many?
11.
11. Okay, so to say much of it is related to nashim, I think is something of an exaggeration. Okay, but we can. What is, I think, important and interesting to note is that the part of nidarim that deals with nashim is the last 2 chapters, and it's not unusual in Mishnah for the main topic of a tractate to be located in the latter part of the Masechet. I'll give you one quick, easy example. Tractate Brachot. There's a tractate called Brachot. Now, the tractate called Brachot comprises 9 chapters, of which 4 are devoted to benedictions, to Brachot. And the 4 are, as you've already guessed, the last 4. Chapter 6, 7, 8, 9 talk about brachot mostly over food, chapters 6 through 8, food, meals. And chapter 9 is a medley of different kinds of brachot. Okay, for natural phenomena, for individual events, a whole series of brachot in the last chapter. That's 4 out of 9 chapters that are devoted to brachot. The first 5 chapters are about Kriyat Shema and the Shmona Esrei prayer. Okay, prayer in general, and focus mostly on the Shmona Esrei prayer. So that means that really the first 5 chapters are, as it were, an introduction to the main topic of the tractate. Masechet Rosh Hashanah, I promised one example, I'll give you a second one. Masechet Rosh Hashanah, 4 chapters. The last 2 are about Rosh Hashanah. The first 2 are about sanctifying the new moon. Okay, so so here we have a couple of examples of where the main topic that gives the tractate its name, in this case, not the name, but the placement within Seder Nashim, okay, come at the end of the tractate. Although here it's only 2 out of 11, so that's a little sparse. Yes, Deborah. Yeah, you have to
In
unmute yourself.
Psachim, only the last one is about the Seder night.
Okay, you're right. Now, Psachim is an interesting example because the word Psachim actually doesn't refer to the festival. The word Psachim is actually a reference to the sacrifice. Okay? The festival is called Pesach in the singular. The plural, Psachim, it always refers to the sacrifices. So it's really a tractate about the Pesach sacrifice. And the Pesach sacrifice is the last 6 chapters out of 10. Okay?
It just struck me that the most salient feature for us is the Seder night, and that was always at the end.
That's right. Okay, and there are many tractates, which it's the last chapter that remains relevant to us after the destruction of the temple. Okay,
So you're saying it wasn't building up to it, as in the other cases you gave.
Well, Psachim, I think, is actually an interesting example, because the first 4 chapters of Psachim are about aspects of the festival that are relevant today, mostly about chametz.
Right.
Okay, mostly about chametz. That's the first 3 chapters. 4th chapter is a little more complicated. Okay, and then the 10th chapter is relevant because it's about the Seder night. But then you have in between, you have 5 chapters that are about the Pesach sacrifice. And the 10th chapter really brings the 2 themes together, because the Seder night is both the completion of the Pesach sacrifice and what is relevant in contemporary times. So Pesach is really a very interesting example of how themes get woven together. Well, let's get back to Nedarim. Okay, we got into. I think it's valuable to get a sense of how a tractate is structured, and that will help us in future tractates that we'll study as well. We will know to look for an overall structure, okay, of the and I will know that the name doesn't necessarily mean the main theme of the tractate. It could be a particular theme that was put in as a centerpiece. But there are other themes that are equally as important that are treated very often as introductory to the main theme. Okay, so now when we're looking at Tractate Nedarim, so the last 2 chapters are really about a Nashim topic. Now, by the way, in the Torah as well, the laws of Nedarim are brought in the framework of Hafarat Nedarim. There is no section of the Torah that's devoted to Nedarim per se. The term Neder comes up in 1 or 2 other places. Okay, but the main section of the Torah is devoted to Nedarim is Bamidbar chapter 30, towards the end of the book of Bamidbar. And that chapter is all about Hafarat Nedarim. And incidental to discussing Hafarat Nedarim, there are also some of the psukim about what, how to relate to Neder, as more generally. Okay, but in a sense, that's what's happening in the Mishnah as well. The Mishnah is really orienting us towards Hafarat Nedarim at the end of the tractate, but devoting the first 9 chapters to Nedarim from a broader perspective. Okay, now we're going to fine-tune that in a little bit. Okay, but first let's just review some of what's happening within these 2 chapters. Okay, so I think a good way of approaching what goes on in Nedarim chapter 11 is to compare and contrast it with Nedarim chapter 10. We said both Nedarim chapter 10 and Nedarim chapter 11 are about Hafarat Nedarim. But what would distinguish between these 2 chapters? How would we differentiate them?
And just while things are scrolling, if you want to follow along with your own set of Mishnayot, this is chapter 10. Otherwise, the relevant Mishnayot are on screen.
Okay, you see here chapter 10 on the screen, starting with Nara Morasa, continuing with what happens if the father, does the husband do it? She takes a neder when she is betrothed. Okay, what does a father do when his daughter is about to leave his household? Bogeret is a daughter who has grown to the point where she has left his household. Okay, Shomeret Yavam. Okay, she's within a levirate marriage framework. So, to what extent do we view her as being within a marital framework? Okay, a man says to his wife, I want now to either uphold your future Nedarim or to or to annul them in advance. When can hafarat nidarim be done? Okay, that's chapter 10. Now chapter 11. These are the nidarim that you can, that the husband can annul, husband or father can annul. Okay, and now some elaboration. Okay, what are called nidarim of affliction. Okay, continuing. What is considered a neder of affliction? Okay, okay. A woman says, I take a neder, I will not produce anything from my father or for your father, and so on. Is that considered to be a neder beino leveina? That's one of the categories for hafara. Okay, is that a neder that is interpersonal, that connects the two of them? Okay, now his wife takes a neder and he thought it was his daughter. In other words, how specific does the hafara, the annulment, have to be? Can you just say, this woman took a neder, I'm annulling it? Or do you have to be aware, this woman is my daughter, as opposed to this woman is my wife? Okay, or in terms of the content of the neder. Okay, she took a neder about not to eat figs, and he thought she took a neder not to eat grapes. So would that annulment be valid? Okay, or if she took a neder on figs and grapes, does the hafara, does the annulment have to relate to both of them, or can he annul one and uphold the other? Okay, or what if the husband has a day, husband or father has a day in which to annul the neder? Well, what if he says, I didn't realize I could annul it. I knew about the neder, but I didn't know it was possible to annul it, or I knew that it was possible to annul it. I wasn't aware that it was a neder. Okay, so does that day count? And then the next day already he can't do it, or do we say that day doesn't count, and so he gets another day after learning all the relevant facts? Okay, I think that's enough to get a sense of where chapter 11 differs from chapter 10. Any thoughts?
If you're an attendee, I can unmute you, give you the chance to talk if you have any particular thoughts on this.
Excuse me?
But no, it's just been quiet in chat, so I'm okay.
Okay, no one has any suggestions? Okay.
I mean,
Yes.
from very I just found out about this. I didn't do that for very superficial from what I just heard. The chapter 11 seems to be much more focused on him, on the man. Whereas chapter 10 seemed much more about just like whether about her, just about like almost like the details of Hafarat Nedarim in general. And then chapter 11 just seemed a lot more focused on him. That's what I would say, Pragma.
Okay. Any other suggestions?
It seemed that chapter 10 dealt with a younger child, a younger woman than chapter 11. Like her status was a little different.
Okay.
I think
largely just yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I think that the first chapter dealt with who, and the second chapter dealt with specifics of on what, and on if he would limit certain things that she would eat, or on items, while the first one was who has dominion over her and when.
Right. Okay, so I think all of the suggestions have some truth to them. Okay, I think the last suggestion is truer than others in the sense that it applies to more of the details. In other words, there's a kind of ballpark generalization here. Okay, but I would also say chapter 10 is more focused on the people and the nature of their relationship. Okay, the father and daughter, husband and wife, the Nara Morasa, who is in sort of both purviews, the Bogeret, or the Almana, who was already out of that framework, and therefore her Nidarim stand. It's mostly focused on the relationship between the younger or older woman and the person who may or may not, person or people who may or may not have the ability to do the hafara. There's also a bit of talk about the time frame for doing it. Can it be done on festivals, for example? Can it be done at night? Okay, so you have, those kinds of details. It's mostly focused on the who and the nature of the relationship, the relationships that we're discussing. And in chapter 11, there's a lot more discussion of what kind of neder is subject to this to this annulment, and then moving further on, and the annulment. How does the annulment take place? Does the annulment have to relate to all aspects of the neder? If the neder has multiple aspects, does the hafara have to relate to all of them? Can it relate to some of them? Or what if the person who wants to do the annulment is missing relevant knowledge? How will that impact on his ability to do the hafara? So we're talking a lot more about the mechanics, both the mechanics of the neder that can be annulled and the mechanics of the annulment itself. Okay, so I think overall that generalization is closest to the differentiation between the chapters. Again, this is now very much in the style of how Mishnah will organize things. With now it doesn't mean every single detail is going to fit that generalization. Mishnah is not structured mathematically. Okay, so it's not going to fit exactly, but I think if you go through the two chapters, you'll find like an 80% fit with these two generalizations. Okay, so that'll give us a kind of overall view of what's going on in these chapters. Let me zero in on what happens at the end of chapter 11, both because that's one of the chapters you're supposed to be looking at, and because the end of a tractate always is worthy of attention. Okay, so let's look. Let's look here. V'neder almana ugrusha yakum aleha. That's already interesting because the Mishnah doesn't that often quote psukim. Mishnah usually just presents the statements, usually halachic statements, occasionally agadic statements. So we have here, and occasionally they'll take a pasuk and interpret it. V'neder almana ugrusha yakum aleha. Okay, ketzad. Now look at how the Mishnah illustrates the neder. What kind of neder are we illustrating? Ketzad. Amra hareini nizira lachar 30 yom. Af al pi sheniseit betoch 30 yom, eino yachol lahafer. Okay, so there's an interesting case that the Mishnah discusses here. Okay, a woman takes a neder that will only go into effect 30 days in the future. Okay, it's possible to do that. That's a form of condition. It's a conditional neder, and the condition is 30 days have to elapse. And then in the okay, now he takes that she takes that neder when she is unmarried. Neder amano grusha. She's not married. And then within the 30 days, she gets married. So you might think, well, she got married within the 30 days, so now he can annul the neder. It says, no, eino yachol lafer. Why not? He can only annul a neder that she took while she was married. But a neder that she took prior to the marriage is not subject to annulment, even if the neder didn't go into effect. That's the catch here. The neder didn't go into effect until she was married. Doesn't matter. The fact that the neder was uttered, was solemnized, even though it hadn't gone into effect prior to the marriage, means it is not subject to annulment. Okay, so now that gives you an interesting perspective on the relationship between annulment and marriage. But there's something else that's very interesting here. The example that the Mishnah selects. The Mishnah selects as an example of an neder. The Mishnah could have selected any example of an neder. It could be, I will forego eating figs in another 30 days. I will forego eating grapes. Those are examples the Mishnah used earlier, right? Not to eat figs, not to eat dates, not to serve your father, not to serve my father. These are all nidarim. There are all kinds of examples of nidarim. Which example was selected here of a neder? Hareini Nizira. Why is that interesting?
Because of what's going to come.
Exactly. Because the next tractate is Nazir. And what we see here is something, this is a thesis I presented at a World Congress of Jewish Studies lecture a couple of years ago. And not all the scholars were happy with this idea. But I'm convinced that it's true. And here I think is a very fine example that there is an order to the tractates of the Mishnah. It's usually assumed in contemporary scholarship that the order of the tractates of the Mishnah is a function of size. And in fact, in 5 out of the 6 Sidarim of Mishnah, that in fact is true. Okay, take Seder Nashim, good example. The first tractate, Yevamot, has 16 chapters. Ketubot has 13. Nidarim has 11. Nazir has 9. Sotah has 9. Gitin has 9. Kiddushin has 4. So, descending order. That's how 5 out of the 6 orders of the Mishnah are arranged. And most scholars say, that's it. That's how it's arranged. Okay? But I'm convinced that that's putting the cart before the horse. I'm convinced that the Mishnah redactor first decided what the order of the tractates is going to be, and then he made sure that the first tractate would have the most number of chapters, the second would have the next largest number, and the third would keep on going down the line. And this is the kind of phenomenon that, to my mind, proves the point. It's clear to me the Mishnah redactor concluded Tractate Nidarim with a wink towards Tractate Nazir. Now, why he did that, we will have to discuss, but we'll discuss that when we start discussing Masechet Nazir. Okay? But first, let's just continue reading a little further. Here we have a kind of summary Mishnah that summarizes which women can have their vows annulled and which cannot. okay, by the father primarily. Okay, then we have a woman who takes a neder that she will not derive benefit from her father or her father-in-law if she if she prepares anything for her husband. So you might say, well, this is not either of the two categories that are subject to annulment are inui, affliction, or beino leveina, something that affects their relationship. This neder, does it affect their relationship? Ostensibly, no, because her neder is, I will not derive benefit from my father or your father. That has nothing to do with him. But why does it have something to do with him? Because there's a condition.
I just want to bring up
If
a
I
question
do
from the chat.
anything on your behalf, then I will be forbidden to them. So because the condition affects their relationship, we view that as part and parcel of the neder, and that hareze yafer, that is subject to afara. And now the last Mishnah of the tractate, Barishona hayu omrim, okay, shalosh nashim yotzot v'notlot ktuba. Guess what? This is harking back to Masechet Ktubot. A woman who, okay, Barishona, in the initial fundamental halacha, would have to get divorced, but would be entitled to receive her Ktuba. Okay, now, okay, so that's harking back to Masechet Ktubot, which is the previous Masechet, right? Ktubot and then Nidarim. So here we again see, at the end of the tractate, we're looking forward to Sotah and also casting a backward glance at Ktubot. Okay? And what woman needs to be divorced? A woman who has done something that fundamentally affects her relationship with her husband. Because this goes beyond just a neder beino leveina. The husband can just annul it, and that's the end. Here we're talking about something that strikes at the heart of their marital relationship. For example, she comes and she says, I am impure to you, meaning I've been unfaithful, okay, and thereby she becomes forbidden to him. Because even if he wants to maintain her, it's halachically problematic. Or shamayim beini leveincha, which is which is a euphemistic way of saying that he's impotent. She says, we have not been able to consummate the marriage because you have been unable to perform. Nitulani min hayudim. That's neder. That's what gets this Mishnah into Nidarim. Nitulani min hayudim. I have taken a neder not to benefit from the Jewish people as a whole. That, of course, includes him. If she can't benefit from him, she can't stay married to him. Okay, and then they said, we don't want the woman to be able to dissolve a marriage so easily, because we're afraid that there might be women who might abuse that. Okay, and therefore we found other solutions for these problems. But note how the concluding Mishnah of Nidarim very much emphasizes the connection between Nidarim and Seder Nashim. Okay, now I just wanted very briefly to share with you that.
Can I just jump in with one question from the chat?
Sure, absolutely.
This is from Ilana Becker. Ilana, let me know if I got this right. Ilana asks, why would the redactor want it to go in descending order?
I don't actually know what the answer to that is. It might be a question of importance. Now, the first is the most important, and so it's the longest. Say in Seder Moed that starts with Shabbat, that would be very very enticing possibility. I don't know if that works in all the Sidarim. I don't really know what the answer is. One thing I do know is this was a common way of redacting larger works in the ancient world. Okay, Professor Menachem Kahana, who wrote about this whole idea of not only numbers of chapters, but numbers of tractates within a Seder and how those are structured. He noted that he brought several examples in the ancient world. The idea that a work would be presented in descending size order was fairly common. So what the rationale for it is, I'm not really sure. But that there was such a way of redacting is quite clear, and not only Jewish works. If I remember correctly, I think the Quran is structured in that way. He brought some example from Muslim literature. I think it was the Quran itself. If not, then some later Muslim work. He brought examples from other cultures as well. So that was a fairly common way of doing things. Okay, now, if you go backwards in Masechet Nedarim, once you've asked the question, what's it doing in Seder Nashim, and noted that the last two chapters are the main connection between this tractate and Seder Nashim, if you start going backwards in the tractate, you'll see many, many other places in the tractate which link it to Seder Nashim, starting with the end of chapter 9. Okay, the very end of chapter 9, some of you may recall, okay, is a very impressive narrative about the person who vowed that he would not have anything to do with his niece, and then people wanted to marry him off. That was common in the times of Chazal, to marry your niece. Okay, and Rabbi Yishmael found a way around the neder. Okay, he brought her in, he beautified her. Okay, and he said, "Is this the woman you say you vowed you would marry?" No, not at all. Great, neder is abolished. You can now marry her. Okay, so you see how Hatarat Nedarim, this is not Hafarat Nedarim now. This is a sage, okay, is able to rescue a marital connection by means of Hatarat Nedarim. We're not going to work this through, but if you go back and review the Mishnah, you've all been sent this source sheet. Look at the Mishnayot on this source sheet, and you'll see how often Masechet Nedarim makes reference to Nedarim affecting family relationships. And in fact, by and large, I'm sure you discussed this in going through Masechet Nedarim. By and large, Masechet Nedarim is pretty down on Nedarim, pretty negative on it. If you don't remember that, we'll see it shortly when we get to Masechet Nazir. And one of the main reasons, there's several reasons why Nedarim are considered to be problematic, but one of the main reasons, and I think the one that the Mishnah focuses on most heavily, is because Nedarim are so often used in socially divisive ways. Okay? The usual kind of a neder is directed at somebody else. There are the occasional nedarim where a person is trying to enhance himself spiritually. By and large, the nedarim we encounter throughout Tractate Nedarim are nedarim where I'm angry with somebody and say, I take a neder, I will never get benefit from you. Or I take a neder that you can never get benefit from me. And often as not, it's within a family. And Masechet Nedarim several times shows you how family relationships can be adversely affected, but it's not only family relationships. Social relationships in general can be adversely affected by Nidarim. So when you see that, I think you get a keener sense of why Masechet Nidarim is in Seder Nashim. Okay, let's move on to Masechet Nazir. And I don't know if we'll have time for much more than a general introduction to Masechet Nazir, but since up until now you haven't even finished the first chapter of Masechet Nazir, it's fine. We can come back and fill in some of the gaps, Bezrat Hashem, next week when we go through the first and second chapters of Masechet Nazir, including maybe some of the first Mishnayot in Masechet Nazir we won't have a chance to get to today. But let's start off by looking at the biblical background to Nazir. Okay, a few points I'd like to zero in on in the biblical passage about Nazir, which is in Bamidbar chapter 6. Okay, the first thing is, as you see, I've highlighted here on the screen the word lahazir and various forms of that word. And by following that word, we can see some very interesting things about the Nazir. Okay, let's start off with a simple question. Why is the Nazir called the Nazir? What does the word Nazir mean?
It has a few meanings.
Okay.
To separate and a crown, I think, are the two main meanings.
Okay. Which of them is applicable to the Nazir?
Both.
How do you know that? Let's take a look. Okay,
It's in the Chumash right here.
That's right. It's right here. It's bolded and marked off in red, right? Daber b'nei Yisrael v'ata lehem ish o isha ki yafli lindor neder nazir lehazir lashem. Now, what does the word lahazir mean? Miyayin v'shechar yazir. What is he doing with yayin and shechar? Lahazir is a cognate word to
Separate.
lehadir, right? Neder and nezer are cognate words. Dalit and zayin in Hebrew often are interchangeable. So nezer is like a cognate word of neder. Lahazir means to separate yourself. Okay? Lahazir Lashem, to separate himself towards Hashem or on behalf of Hashem. And how does he do that? Miyayin v'shechar yazir. He separates himself from wine, and shechar is another kind of grape beverage, right? So that's the first aspect. But then you see further down, Nezer Elohav al Rosho. He has a crown of God on his head. What is the crown of God on his head?
His hair.
His hair. That's the previous pasuk. Look at pasuk Hey. Right after pasuk Dalet, Kol Yemei Nizro Mikol Asher Yasem Yigefen Yayim Echatzanim Adzag Lo Yochel. Stay away from grapes, not only wine, but even from grapes. In pasuk Hey, Ta'ar Lo Yavor Al Rosho. He can't cut his hair. Ad Melot Hayamim, until the end of the period. Now, one thing we learn from here is that Nazir is something limited in time. It's circumscribed in time. Ad Melot Hayamim. The Neder Nazir will include a specified amount of time. That's one of the first main topics of Tractate Nazir. Okay? What is that specified amount of time? There is a standard specified amount of time that the Mishnah talks about. Now, from the Torah, that's not so clear. Okay? So, until the end of that time, no haircuts. And Pasuk Vav, Kol Yemei Aziro Lashem al Nefesh Meit Lo Yavo. We now have a third halacha. Okay? He may not come into contact with the dead. So you might say that's something separate. But then the Torah actually weaves two themes together. Okay, father, mother, brother, sister, he cannot defile himself when they die. Who does that remind us of?
Kohen.
Kohanim.
Not Kohanim.
Kohen Gadol.
Kohen Gadol. The Kohen is not allowed to defile himself through the dead except for the relatives listed here. But the Kohen Gadol is prohibited to defile himself even to the closest relatives. So the Nazir, in that sense, like the Kohen Gadol, and even more, Ki nezer Elohav al Rosho, because on his head he has the crown of his God. That is a term that appears with the Kohen Gadol as well. Ki nezer shemen mishchat Elohav alav ani Hashem. Parshat Emor. Okay, so the Kohen Gadol, the Nazir's hair is his divine crown upon his head, and that's why he can't defile himself through the dead. So there's actually a correlation here. It's because of the hair that he's also prohibited from defiling himself to the dead. And in fact, as the Torah goes on in Pasuk Tet, if he somehow encounters a dead person, befeta pitom, it happens upon him, he couldn't prevent it, v'timei rosh nizro, and that defiles his Nazir head. Again, it's related to the hair. What does he have to do then? He has to purify himself and then shave off the hair and bring sacrifices. That's called the tiglachat tum'ah, okay? The shaving off of the hair in order to purify himself, and then he presses restart on his Nazirut, starts the count all over again. And at the end of his Nazirut, he brings sacrifices together with, what does he do together with bringing the sacrifices?
He cuts his hair.
Shaves off the hair. And what does he do with the hair?
He throws it into the korban, into the fire.
That's right. Not exactly into the korban, but into the fire underneath the korban that is being cooked, the shlamim. Okay, the shlamim that he and his friends and neighbors consume. Okay, so it goes into the fire. Okay, Pasuk Yurchet v'gilach hanazir petach ol moed et rosh nizro. Once again, lakach etzar rosh nizro v'natan al ha'esh asher tachat zebach hashlamim. Okay, that I think gives us a basic picture. One further thing, another term that I have highlighted here is the term kadosh. A Nazir is holy. Now that, of course, goes together with staying away from impurity. And if in some respect he is like a Kohen Gadol, and if he has a divine crown on his head, then it does stand to reason that he is holy. Okay? Now, in Tanakh, we know this is only one model of a Nazir. There is another model of a Nazir, at least one other model of Nazir that we find in the Tanakh. Namely,
Shimshon.
Shimshon, who exemplifies a Nazir who
From
never
birth.
shaves, never brings a korban, because his Nazirut never ends. Right? Permanent Nazirut, a personality who is a Nazir inherently. It's also worth noting that Shimshon never took a neder. The Nazir we're talking about here took a neder to become a Nazir, and like easy come, easy go, right? He became a Nazir by word of mouth, and so he ends his Nazirut based on his word of mouth, but he has to have a transitional process of shaving and bringing the sacrifices. But Shimshon, of course, okay, how do we know he's a Nazir? Because he grows his hair, and does he have to stay away from wine? Not exactly, but his mother has to. His mother, during the pregnancy, has to stay away from wine. Okay, today they would stay away from wine for, because alcohol affects the fetus. But, in those days, wine was a much more prevalent beverage. You stay away from wine because ki nazir Elohim yanar min habeten ad yom moto. So there's the hair aspect of Shimshon, which is the main aspect of his Nazirut. There is his mother staying away from anything to do with wine. Okay, what about defiling himself through contact with the dead?
No, he was always near the death.
He was near death all the time, right? So that seems not to be applicable to him. Okay, we'll get to Avshalom a little later, that we can get to the context of Nazir chapter 1. Okay, now one other model of Nazir that we find, a couple of psukim, there's a pasuk in Echa as well. I took the pasuk from Amos. Okay, that's my hometown. I live in Tekoa. Amos was from my hometown of Tekoa. And he writes about a Nazir. I established from amongst your children, I established prophets, and from your chosen young men, Nizirim. God established Nizirim. Same way God selected prophets, he selected Nizirim. So Nazirim are holy men. Are these temporary holy men? Doesn't sound that way. Just like being a Navi is a lifetime job, sounds like being a Nazir is a lifetime job that God selects. And then, the complaint against Israel is Vatashkuat Nazirim Yain. Israel defiled the Nazirim. They forced them to drink wine. And they commanded the prophets not to prophesy. That's the complaint against Israel, the accusation against Israel. But you have a sense here of a person who is devoted, has a lifetime devotion to being a Nazir. These are the models. Okay, now just one final comment before we conclude. Okay, about Nazir chapter 1. Okay, let's see. Yeah, okay, so it'll take me a bit too long to get the text up, but let's just note one thing about the opening of Tractate Nazir. Okay, Tractate Nazir opens with the languages. It opens with Kinuye Nazirut Kinazirut, where you don't exactly say, I will be a Nazir. You say it in a roundabout fashion. There are actually a couple of roundabout fashions that you could use that the Mishnah lists. Okay, and it says you will be a Nazir. Does that opening unit of Masechet Nazir remind you of anything?
Of the Nadarim?
Nidarim.
The opening Mishnah of Nidarim is almost identical to the opening Mishnah of Nazir. It starts with Kol Kinuye Nidarim Kinidarim. Okay, if you don't have it on your screen, but check it out as you progress through the book of through the tractate of Nazir, starting with Mishnah Vav, I believe, is what you're starting with this coming week. But go back and look at the first Mishnah of Nazir and compare it to the first Mishnah of Nidarim, and you'll see once again Nidarim and Nazir are a team. Okay, and you can think about why, and we'll open with that question, Bezrat Hashem, next week. So I wish you all a Shavua Tov and a Chodesh Tov.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for
you
coming
so
today to
much.
learn with Rav Avie. I hope to see you all next week. And with that, take care. Chodesh Tov. Good day.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Chodesh Tov.